Welcome to this forum. I really appreciate all of you coming out, and I'm really excited about this as well. My name's David Dent. I'm the moderator, and I'm going to introduce our panelists and say a little bit about their work. And from there, we're going to open up the conversation. They'll have some things to say about the issues, and then we will also open it up to your questions. And so starting to my far left is Gayle Buckley. Her first book, The Horns: An American Family, is an inspired history of Buckley's mother, musical legend Lena Horne, and her family. Buckley traces Horne's roots, the Horne family roots, from post-Civil War Reconstruction up to the present day. Her second book, published in 2001, is a history of African-American involvement in the military. She's also written for the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Vogue, the New York Daily News, among others. And her latest book, which is here, is The Black Calhouns, which was released about a year ago. And it follows her family history from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement, starting with her great-great-grandfather, Moses Calhoun, a slave-turned-businessman. Author and journalist A'Lelia Bundles is author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, which is her great-great-grandmother. Bundles is also at work now on her fifth book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, and that's a biography of her great-grandmother. Bundles is a former network television news executive and producer for both ABC and NBC News, and she's also vice chair of Columbia University's Board of Trustees and immediate past chair of the National Archives Foundation Board. The winner of a Pulitzer Prize for criticism, Margo Jefferson, has been a book, theater, and arts critic for the New York Times and Newsweek. She's written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, New York Magazine, Vogue, Book Forum, the Washington Post, and The Nation, among others. And her work has been anthologized in many places, among them The Best American Essays, The Inevitable, Contemporary Writers Confront Death, The Best African American Essays, and The Jazz Cadence of American Culture. Her memoir, Negroland, received the 2015 National Book Critics' Choice Award for autobiography, and that book is here. And it also won the Heartland Prize and the Bridge International Prize. She's also author of On Michael Jackson, and she teaches writing at Columbia University, but we also have to say that her first teaching experience was here in the NYU Department of Journalism, and we still miss her. Shomari Wills is author of Black Fortunes, the story of 6 African Americans who escaped slavery and became millionaires. Wills himself is a descendant of John Drew, a bus line proprietor, Wall Street investor, Negro League Baseball team owner. He was an early black millionaire as well. Wills has worked for CNN and Good Morning America and has contributed to the New York Caribbean News and Columbia Journalism Review. He received his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College and a graduate degree from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he was named a Linton Book Writing Fellow. I actually want to begin also with Wills and your book, and a scene in your book. It's 1852, and the Frederick Douglass's paper runs a series on black wealth that's written by James McCune Smith. And Smith is a public intellectual at the time, and also one of the first African Americans to receive an MD degree. In the series, Smith asks a question. He says, who is the better man, Samuel Ringo Ward, an abolitionist, or Jeremiah Hamilton, the richest black man in New York City? And as Wills notes, that the tone of the piece, of the article, was that wealth and activism were binary characteristics, quoting straight from the book, in the frame of that piece. One could either seek liberation or seek wealth, but not both. Then there's the story, though, that he tells of Mary Ellen Pleasant, one of the millionaires featured in the book, as we said. And she did what she often does, as you say, with conflicting ideas. She harmonized them in the way that only she could. In 1858, 6 years after that piece ran, she met abolitionist John Brown. They had a meeting in Canada, and she gave him $45,000, which today would be $1.3 million. And that money was for John Brown's raid, to fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which is the armed slave revolt that occurred in 1859. Travel 11 years later, and we meet Lena Calhoun, who's the daughter of patriarch Moses Calhoun. And she would enroll in Nashville's Fisk University. There, the 16-year-old met 17-year-old classmate W.E.B. Du Bois. As Gayle Buckley notes in The Black Calhouns, Du Bois not only fell in love at first sight with Lena, but found an iconic label for his fellow black missionary teachers to be. He called them the Talented Tenth, or would call them the Talented Tenth. And as she chronicles that the Talented Tenth, as we know, the theory is that the tenth should uplift the other 90% of the race by taking on the roles of leadership. Du Bois, of course, his life would intersect with Madam C.J. Walker, whose journey to wealth, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy are documented in Aurelia Bundle's book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. Walker, as Bundles notes, was just another black baby destined for drudgery and ignorance to the world beyond her family, her family's rented plot of ground in Delta, Louisiana. But to her parents, she surely must have symbolized hope, since unlike her slave-born siblings, she was born 5 years after, a few years shy, 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And finally, as we look at Madam C.J. Walker, Mary Pleasant, and Lena Calhoun, we might say they're all at the foundation of what Margo Jefferson calls Negroland, the title of her book. She writes, "I call it Negroland because I still find Negro to be a word of wonders, glorious and terrible, a word for runaway slave posters and civil rights proclamations, for social constructs and street corner flaunts, a tonal language word whose meaning shifts as setting and context shift, as history twists, lurches, advances, and stagnates." Now, the word stagnates, I think, is a really good starting point to consider the legacy of the creation of black dynasties and the contemporary racial landscape. And I want to start there with Margo Jefferson, and if you don't mind. And I want the four of you to share your views, basically in looking at the legacy of black dynasties in the context of the contemporary racial landscape.
Well, you know, there are many, one of the interesting things about, oh, yes. One of the interesting things about the Talented Tenth, the elite, et cetera, is that dynasties are, they're homemade. They're built from the ground up. They take many forms. There can be, we tend to think of dynasties as, you know, this legacy that gets passed on for many generations. Many black dynasties sprung up with one person, like the people you write about, who were extraordinarily, or, Madam C.J. Walker, who were extraordinary, or Moses, resourceful. They couldn't guarantee that all of that was going to be passed on to their children. That's the stagnation you're talking about. I think, every generation, one of the interesting things after the Civil War, for example, is the move of blacks who had been not free blacks. They had been enslaved. Some of them had been considered too dark-skinned to move into the tiny teeny little circle of relatively privileged blacks while slavery was on. But with each generation, a new group worked its way into, education, into, to some extent, finance. But we are not, really it was education. We are not talking about generations of dynasties. We're often talking about a family that, well, for example, actually I will give you an example. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a construction supervisor. He had a little company, and they built things. This was not major. His wife was a teacher. They moved from Mississippi, where opportunities were scant and hostility was rife. They moved to California. The boys, all three of the sons, subsequently became doctors and lawyers, then judges. The one daughter, little gender typecasting, became a teacher. But when my cousin, the son of the youngest brother, announced that he wanted to be a journalist, he is now in his late 70s, my grandmother pulled herself up and said, all of the men in our family are doctors or lawyers. This had just happened with her children. This had not happened before. And to me, this is also an example of how we invent and have to work so hard to sustain, these families, these perilous, though deeply impressive dynasties. The longest legacy may be in the churches, the businesses, the civil rights institutions that, people with some money and privilege founded. But dynasties are very fragile and perilous. My theory is that this is one reason Black Panther is so popular. It's a vision, a sci-fi vision of the quintessential fairy tale Black dynasty, Wakanda.
Very interesting. What's interesting there is you also talked about education being kind of a key component. And what, a lot of the data, which we'll talk about, many of the studies that have come out most recently, show that there has been the biggest progress that we've seen in terms of economic parity to some degree is in education, but it's not in economics and other factors. So, that's, I think, interesting. Let's throw it our way here to Gayle Buckley to kind of look at that question.
Well, the perspective of my book is from sorry. Hello? Can you hear? Okay. The perspective of my book is from 1865 to 1965, which is a totally different America. And even then, there were generational differences. My great-great-grandfather, Moses Calhoun, was a slave. He was freed when he was 36 years old. He had luck on his side. He could read and write. He'd been a house slave in Noonan, Georgia, a town just outside of Atlanta, not a plantation. And he had a relatively generous former owner. All of these factors were markers for success in freedom. He had been the butler, and his mother the cook, and his sister the nursemaid, to one of the richest men in Georgia, one Andrew Bonaparte Calhoun, a cousin of John C. Calhoun, arch white supremacist. In 1870, Andrew Bonaparte Calhoun willed an acre of land to Moses' mother. It is agreed by the modern white Calhouns that the black and white Calhouns were probably related. Land would have not been something to give to someone who was just a slave. Moses married almost the moment he was free and was determined to make money. With the help of his former owner, he opened a grocery store, started a restaurant and catering service, and opened a boarding house, all of which the white power structure approved of as natural to upper servants. He was just in time for Reconstruction. He had two daughters who both graduated from new so-called missionary colleges, Atlanta University and Fisk, where W.E.B. Du Bois fell madly in love with Moses' younger sister, Lena, and described the family, according to David Levering Lewis's Du Bois biography, as mulattoes with money. In 1886, according to Atlanta Constitution, called my great-great-grandfather the wealthiest colored man in Atlanta. He seemed to have accumulated property and used money entirely for the benefit of himself and his family. He seemed uninterested in racial equality. His grandmother, however, by the way, also a talented cook, had brought the freedom of herself, her husband, and her youngest children by selling her cakes and pies on the street corner and moved to Chicago just before the war. Money was all about survival and freedom. There were geographic as well as generational differences. Moses' son-in-law, my great-grandfather, Edwin Horn, born free in Indiana, of mixed Indian and white heritage, because it was easier in Indiana to be black rather than Indian. Edwin, whose father was English and whose mother was Indian, self-identified as a colored man. As a young teacher, he gave a speech at the opening of a colored school in Evansville, saying that black children needed to be educated, virtuous, self-denying, and frugal to succeed. By the time he married Moses' elder daughter, Cora, he was editor of a black weekly paper, an entrepreneur as a part owner of a drugstore. He was a Republican activist and almost got a federal appointment under Indiana native son Benjamin Harrison, but the job, traditionally black during Reconstruction, went to former Senator Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi. In 1896, with Plessy versus Ferguson entrenching white supremacy and opening the doors for Jim Crow, Edwin and Cora moved to New York. Knowing where the money was, Edwin became one of the founders of an organization known as Black Tammany. As a Democrat, Edwin gave up virtue and education for political power and money. Tammany rewarded him for swerving the black male vote against Republicans for the first time in New York voting history. Insofar as Tammany wanted the black vote, Edwin fought the battle for racial favors, not equality. Thanks to Edwin, Harlem got its own National Guard unit, the 15th New York, which became the storied 369th National Guard Regiment, the most highly decorated and longest-serving American unit in the war, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. By the way, Edwin's wife, Cora, Moses' older daughter, remained a Republican all her life and joined every equal rights or feminist organization in existence. And in 1919, enrolled her 2-year-old granddaughter, my mother, Lena Horn, as a lifetime member of the NAACP. Edwin's Tammany wealth allowed his wife to be an activist for racial equality. Edwin's son, my grandfather, Edwin Jr., known as Teddy, had no interest in the battle for equality, but he loved money. More money than any black man could legally make at the time. He ran away from his young wife and baby, and his Tammany patronage job in New York's Department of Labor under Frances Perkins, who would become the first female cabinet member in history under FDR, to make a small killing on the 1919 Black Sox baseball scandal, and never looked back. He made enough money as a gambler on the fringes of the rackets and was never in trouble with the law, and he had a very colorful 1920s, able to buy fabulous automobiles and expensive dolls and fur coats for the child he never saw. He had absolutely no interest in the battle for equality, but had front row seats at every sporting event of the decade. And he was one of the few blacks allowed into the Cotton Club in 1933, where he was seated near the kitchen to see his 16-year-old chorus daughter perform, because his best friend, a former World War black officer, was now the numbers king of Harlem. And he had a cordial acquaintance with gangsters, Oney Madden and Legs Diamond, who owned the club. The gangster connection was lucky for my mother, the 16-year-old who was known to be famously protected. Nearly 10 years later, Teddy Horn brokered his daughter's Hollywood contract at MGM by telling Louis B. Mayer he could afford to hire a maid for his daughter, so he didn't want her to play one in the movies.
Well, to follow that, actually, I would actually ask Wills to follow up with kind of the resemblances between what you document in the stories and what Gail has just described in terms of her family heritage.
Yeah, so my book takes place, starts in the antebellum period during slavery, and it begins telling the stories of the very first black people that were able to achieve wealth. And David kind of touched on it. What were they to do with that wealth? What was their responsibility, and how would they be able to retain that wealth? So, the story that I like to tell is the story of William Leidesdorff, who, as far as my research can tell, he was the very first African-American millionaire. So he was the son of a black woman from the Caribbean and a Jewish man, a white man. And he lived in Louisiana, did quite well as a businessman for several years, passing for white. He had fair skin, but he had curly red hair. But New Orleans was kind of a polyglot, so you could, pass even with some darker features. After he was outed, he went to San Francisco, California, when it was still part of Mexico in the 1840s. And he got in good with the Mexican government, and they gave him about 30,000 acres of land. If you actually look at the maps, he basically owned almost all of Sacramento. Fast forward a couple years, 1848, Sutter's Mill, gold is discovered, and the value of this land goes somewhere to about $1.4 million. Not in today's dollars, in 1840s dollars. He died mysteriously from a virus shortly after that, and a white real estate speculator basically went to the Virgin Islands, found his mother, who was pretty much illiterate, and said, sign all this land over to me for $75,000, which I'm sure to her seemed like a lot of money, but it was actually worth about $1.3, $1.4 million. So one of the things that I deal with in my book is not only how difficult and how extraordinary it was for these folks to be able to achieve such great wealth, but the rigors they had to deal with in order to retain it. And I think it illustrates that early on in this country, there was a system that was not set up for African Americans to retain wealth. And that echoes still throughout history, whether it was not being able to access banks, not access the stock market, not being able to go to court. His family, William Leidesdorff's family, tried to sue. They couldn't take this guy to court because they were black, because the sort of apartheid system that existed back then said blacks couldn't go to court. So the financial system was not set up for blacks to succeed, and that allowed for a lot of plunder. And I think it also affected the culture in the way black folks deal with money. That we were not used to necessarily planning estates, to make sure the wealth traveled down through the generations. Because black people used to be in people's wills, right? They didn't used to have wills. You would say, hey, my son gets, this slave, my daughter gets that slave, and that's how we used to be dealt with. So coming right out of slavery, the concept of planning an estate and having a will was very novel. And then at the same time, we couldn't access most banks. So it's taken a little bit longer for the culture, the financial culture, to develop because of the way we were kept out of it, and also just the lack of protections African Americans have had in this country have made it easier for plunder, for folks to take our wealth, take our intellectual property from, George Washington Carver, who owns a fraction of the patents he should have, to, Henrietta Lacks, we all know about this. So that echoes throughout history, and you fast forward to today, black income has gotten pretty close to white income, which is the good news. Black wealth, net worth, and white net worth are still very far apart. And depending to which figures you look at, it's getting somewhat worse in the last decade. So I think there's a long history in America of making it not only difficult for African Americans to achieve wealth, but for them to maintain it.
Clearly, actually, how do you see Madam C.J. Walker in the context of that? I mean, she's a contemporary of many of the people that Wills writes about, and just in terms of the fragility in creating black dynasties, so to speak.
So there are a whole lot of things that people have said that I want to respond to, but I will start with Madam Walker. So, just Madam Walker created her company in 1906. She died in 1919. And by then she had established a business with an attorney who crossed the T's and dotted the I's and made sure the taxes were paid. made sure that the will was written, made sure that everybody who needed to be paid. So she, unlike many people, set up a business and was very careful. We are very fortunate today that those business records, we're able to document what Madam Walker did because the business records were well kept, and they are at the Indiana Historical Society. So that's something that there are many, many famous black people who had great wealth, and nobody can really tell where their wealth was and who lost their wealth because they didn't really have good business systems and they didn't have good lawyers. So I think that was really key for her. The company continued to do relatively well until the Depression. And a lot of people will blame her daughter, about whom I'm writing a biography, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, for spending all the money. And you know, that's so simplistic. it's not that easy. She did spend money, but the company, like many companies, including Ford Motor Company and other white-owned companies, really took a big hit during the Depression, and her customers could not afford 35 cents and 50 cents for her tins. But the company actually never went out of business. It has continued even to today, and that is also very rare. Continuing a company past the first generation happens, I think it's something like 1 in 10, and past 4 generations, it's 1 in 100 or something like that. But it's, it's very, very rare. Now, there are complications throughout that more than 100 years of the Walker Company. When Madam Walker founded it in the 1980s, it was actually sold to another group, and they weren't really major competitors. The company itself, during the 1950s, was not keeping up with the times, and so we talk now about disruption in all kinds of things, in groceries, in tech, and all of these things. The Walker Company and Madam Walker's main competitors were doing an old style, hairdos and press and comb, and the chemical straighteners came along. They disrupted the market. Now when I look out, I see that there are very few people who have chemical straighteners. The market has been disrupted again. One of those disruptors was Sundial Brands, owned by Richelieu Dennis. Richelieu Dennis bought the Madam Walker brand about 6 years ago, and the Walker products are now sold in Sephora. They are part of Sundial Brands, which also manufactures Shea Moisture, which is a product that many of you have seen in CVS and Target, Nubian Heritage, which is in Whole Foods, and then Madam C.J. Walker, which is the prestige line that's sold exclusively in Sephora. So that Dynasties continued, but not in the way that you would expect, handed down generation to generation. I am a consultant, the historian for that line. So when I was growing up, both my parents worked in the hair care business. My mother was at the Walker Company. My father worked for the Walker Company for a brief period of time, but then became president of Summit Laboratories, one of the companies making chemical hair straighteners. We had big fights about that when I had my afro in high school, but that's a whole nother story. But that is an example, I think, of something that I read about Atlanta in the early 1900s, that many of the wealthy families were, sort of needed the infusion of somebody else who didn't come from one of those wealthy families. Exactly. With some energy. My father was one of those people who didn't come from a wealthy family, who had a lot of energy and a lot of, push. So one other thing I'm mentioning, maybe we can talk about this more, but real estate, and we've talked, Shomari mentioned this, but being able to have wealth, the most families' wealth is in real estate, and I will tell this story quickly and shut up, but when my parents were buying a new house in Indianapolis in an all-black suburb, all the new houses were being built, most of the fathers were Korean and World War II vets. They were teachers, doctors, lawyers, plumbers, carpenters, architects. They could not get bank loans. They got loans from Mammoth Life Insurance, a black insurance company.
Well, one of the things that we've talked about wealth, and then there's also just the intersection of wealth and activism. And this brings me to the article in the New York Times yesterday that looked at Erica Garner's very young death, that looked at the fact that the lives of activists are often impoverished and full of and despair-filled. And these are people who are actually at the forefront of fighting for equality. Is there a difference, but when you look at the today's activists, Black Lives Matter, and their relationship with black wealth, is there a difference between then and is there a difference between that today and what we saw in previous generations, do you think?
Isn't there more money now around? So there's more money for them to, more money to be given, and more white people are giving money to black people.
Well, that's true. No,
Sorry.
that's a very good point.
No, it isn't. I was just forgetting. But I was thinking also, my great-great-grandfather had an account in the Freedmen's Bank, which was an example of trying, and it went bust when Frederick Douglass was asked and made to be the president of it, and he was defeated by it because it was totally corrupt. But the corruption was there from the beginning, which is too bad.
You know, there's also, Black Lives Matter has a serious and sustained critique of what it calls respectability politics, which is generally what we associate with black dynasties, or again, as I would call them, black elites. Yes, there is this impressive legacy of civil rights organizations and giving back to the community. At the same time, it was in the 40s that W.E.B. Du Bois addressed a prestigious black men's club, the Boulé, and said, I was wrong. He was a Marxist by then. I thought that a group of black people who were educated and looking, to the improvement of their people would continue to put that first. No, they put the improvement of themselves first, like any other haute bourgeoisie or elite or upper class, whatever, they're a certain kind of selfishness rule. That's not entirely the case, but that is a very serious critique. And that those divisions, they didn't just happen in the 60s.
So, I would say that when I, especially when I'm talking to kids about Madam Walker, I think she's kind of Black Lives Matter 1.0, and I make that claim because once she had money, as she was getting more money, she was becoming more militant. People were calling upon her to contribute money to the anti-lynching movement. So she gave $5,000 to the NAACP. It was the largest donation they had ever received to the anti-lynching movement. She spoke out about discrimination against black soldiers during World War I. She hosted an event at her home in Irvington for Emmett Scott, who was at that point the Secretary of Negro Affairs. And he was nervous about coming because she was friends with Marcus Garvey and A. Philip Randolph and Ida B. Wells. She and Ida B. Wells and Marcus Garvey had been spied upon by a black spy at the War Department, Walter Loving, who called them Negro subversives in his private report. Her attorney was very worried that she was speaking out and that she was being militant, and told her that she was, quote unquote, going to be circumscribed, that she was hanging out with people who didn't have anything to lose. And she had made this money. And in fact, when she applied for a passport to try to go to Paris during the peace talks after the end of the war, her passport was denied.
Before Paul Robeson.
Well, yeah, but he, in fact, I have a baby pictures with Paul Robeson that were sent to A'Lelia Walker. So this is, right, she died before he was born, but.
So money liberated her radicalism.
Right.
Her
Yeah, I
money
mean,
liberated her
exactly,
radicalism.
exactly.
Shomari, the story of Pleasant actually seems to be representative of that to some extent, or, basically in the cases that you document, what?
Yeah, so I think as long as black folks have been resisting, there's been someone there to provide the means to do that. Whether you look at 19th century abolitionism, or you look at the establishment of black folks after slavery. You got to remember, after emancipation, a lot of African Americans were, wandering around homeless without anywhere to go. There were some folks that were able to establish themselves very quickly, but it was a difficult time. People needed jobs, they needed homes. So the establishment of black infrastructure was something that had to happen. And then you get to the anti-lynching and the civil rights. And at each of those steps, there were always people involved providing the means. We know the names of the great activists, but they always had benefactors. Back to Mary Ellen Pleasant, famously John Brown supporters were 6 white men called the Secret Six, wealthy white men who gave him money to set up this basically this military base in Virginia, where they trained to go and attack the United States Armory, take the guns and give them to the slaves and incite a slave revolt. Mary Ellen Pleasant also, gave that money gave money along with the Secret Six. So I guess it was actually a Secret Seven. So at every step of the way, there were folks helping out. One of the characters in my book, Robert Reed Church, who was born a slave in the Mississippi Delta. That's my daughter Zora. He was born a slave in the Mississippi Delta. He escaped during the Civil Wars, swam the freedom in the Mississippi, and just basically washed up on the shores of Memphis and became sort of a real estate titan and a nightlife titan. He used his money. He helped out Ida B. Wells when she was first getting started. He gave black people jobs. He gave black people loans when there were no banks. He had this saloon. And if you were black and you needed some money, you would go to his bar, and he would, peel off some money from his billfold. So there have always been black folks at every step of the way contributing financially to activism, because activism isn't free. All the way up to, Harry Belafonte with the civil rights movement, or, now we're seeing folks like, Jay-Z and Beyonce starting to get involved with Black Lives Matter. So it's, it's part of African Americans' legacy, a part of our history for the wealth class to pitch in a little bit.
At least for a critical mass of the wealth class, or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, there are definitely those that don't.
One of the things that, as we saw in the New York Times a week ago, the piece that on the study, the most recent study that came out that looked at African American males and white males who were born into families were born into the 1%, so to speak, and that white males born into the 1% are likely to remain there or to go to, or basically remain upper middle class, while African American males were likely to be downward mobility, to be products of downward mobility. What does that say about the, kind of the progress? And I'm wondering how that also speaks to what you were saying about the legacy or the fragility, I guess, of Dynasty. I mean, when we look at in the contemporary, black males will, who grow up wealthy, are more likely to be products of downward mobility, as opposed to white males of the same socioeconomic level.
Well, it seems to me that it's pure racism. I mean, it's clear as anything that white men are threatened by black male success. They're not threatened by black female success, but they're threatened by black male success. And it's been true ever since, keeping blacks out of the post-World War II housing developments, keeping them out of the GI Bill. It's just something that is endemic now in America that shouldn't be there, but it's been allowed to fester, allowed to grow, and it comes from the top. And when the leadership is saying it's okay, then it comes out again, which is what's happening now.
Yeah, I would add the historian Eric Foner, who writes a lot about Reconstruction. An interesting thing he talks about is how after emancipation, boxing, bodybuilding, and gun sports became very popular amongst white men. Because suddenly for African American men to be free and at least to have something close to the same legal status as a white man, they found that threatening. So the physical intimidation, was definitely, a factor. The fear of black men, the thingification, as Martin Luther King would say, of black men. And the other thing I would add about that article, it hit very close to home for me for two reasons. So I'm a black male, obviously, and I was a black boy at one point. But if you guys read the article, the young man that they profiled from Silver Spring, who kind of beat the trend, he grew up, he grew up working class and managed to do pretty well. Will actually grew up with him, so
He's running for city council now, or running
yeah,
for
he ran for something a couple years ago.
yeah.
I think he's running for something else now. But they mention that area is Silver Spring from Washington D.C., right across the line from Silver Spring. But the DMV area is kind of an exception to mobility, and I'd say one of the reasons that I personally think that is because of the federal government, of government employment. If you look at the trends, black people overrepresent in government jobs and underrepresent everywhere else because it's harder to discriminate people out of federal jobs.
And some of that also in Prince George's County too, and that
Right.
evolution had a lot to do with government contracting too, and set-asides that were, that made it possible for black businesses to get contracts and the incentive for that to happen. But I'm interested, also in just the fact that.
Yeah, can I just throw in something?
Sure.
Okay, I'm thinking of Rosewood, Tulsa, and Memphis. When blacks were really successful and got into banking and so forth, the response was just destroy that entirely, destroy it. So Rosewood was destroyed, Tulsa, the black community, and the black community in Memphis, I believe it is. And,
The race riots in 1866.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, so I just think, we have to acknowledge, there's always starting over.
Yeah, and apropos of that, when Ida B. Wells started investigating lynching, it turned out that a number of the men lynched had raped no one. They were economically successful, and this was a way of, in fact, destroying their businesses and terrifying and, decimating their families and decimating whatever legacy and inheritance was going to be.
And just one more thing, you're talking about the federal jobs. I think it was Calvin Coolidge, wasn't it, who came in and fired all the blacks who were in the federal
Woodrow
government?
Wilson. Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson. So that was another start over.
Yeah.
Can you, no, that's, someone will grab that mic, and we are going to open it up in a few minutes for questions, but I wanted to follow up about that differential, though. I mean, because it also, on some level, I think there's levels of trickery there when we kind of single out the African-American male in this regard as a victim, and really ignore some of the things that confront black women, sometimes even more so. And I guess that is what makes it very complicated. But that study did show that African American girls were more likely to grow into women that would remain in the socioeconomic status that they had. But a key factor there was the fact that you look at the wealth differential, which you talked about, which has been noted that they were, basically they had incomes, but not necessarily the wealth. And also, if you really look at, to some degree, the fact that that the wealth creation issue, I think, that goes back to what you were talking about in terms of being able to preserve from one generation to the next. I still want to just get to the point. I think you mentioned Jay-Z and Beyonce, and there are many examples today of black wealth that is tied to, I think, activism on some level. So and I think that's something we have to point out. But do you think that, I think that we've reached a point where we went through the Obama era was kind of an era to some degree of innocence, because there was so much hope and so much, I guess you could say, euphoria surrounding his presence as president. And, now all of a sudden there is kind of an ugly awakening with Trumpism that we're seeing. What does that mean to what we call about, what does that do to activism, and what does that do to the preservation of wealth as well?
Well, it's a cycle. It happens all the time. There's a period of regression, then there's a period of progressivism, then it's reactionary period again. We've seen this before. It's nothing new. It's just that it keeps I mean, what we have to do is change whatever is the root of all of this. But I'm not, and that goes back, I mean, very far.
But we're seeing also data that shows the millennial generation has different views. I mean, just, yesterday, the polls are showing they have different attitudes about race that are, of course, different from the elders. And then you see that in the voting patterns, too, to some extent.
I think this is something special. Oh, I think this is a period with the young people from Parkland that we are seeing a whole new change. And I think that's where it's going to come from. It's the next generation is going to do it.
Right. So just like the backlash with the Tea Party, we're having the mirror of that backlash right now. But, I think that the thing that you hope would begin to happen when you know that, less than 1% of the venture capital investment for companies goes to women of color, and that's all women of color. But there are people, I think, as a result of this pendulum swinging who, even though they should have known this all along, how did they not know this all along, but who are awakened and realize that things are not fair and their consciousness is being raised, that they need to invest more, that things are not fair, that the color of law, the Rothstein book about real estate and redline. I mean, all of this evidence is there, and now this moment with Parkland, with the students who were there, with their intersectionality, they're able to now bring some of these conversations back up so that we have something to sort of counter the insanity that goes on at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
I'm optimistic for the future for the first time in ages.
Well, I'm optimistic, but I think one of the things that made me a little bit pessimistic is the banking bill recently. In a lot of the efforts, to push back against racial economic equality are still out there. African Americans are less likely to get approved for a mortgage, and I think Alilia talked about the importance of real estate. Even if same income, same credit score, you control for everything, a black person has still been shown to be less likely to get a mortgage. And we just had a bill passed, actually weakens the protections, for African Americans. So, it definitely is a cycle, it definitely is a cycle that we definitely see the clawing back of the progress constantly.
Okay, well, we'd like to open it up now for questions. If any of you have questions of the panelists, of all of them or one or two individual.
This could be open to, thank you to the entire panel. I'm a descendant of Anthony Crawford. Anthony Crawford in 1916 was lynched. And his lynching was so significant because he was the wealthiest man, black or white, of Abbeville County, South Carolina. In fact, white locals used him as a bank. And he went in to sell his cottonseed, and the man refused, the owner of the grocery or concession, refused to give him a fair price. And he argued with him, and that argument resulted with him being dragged through the black section of Abbeville County and taken to the fairgrounds and shot 400 times, emasculated, and hung. So I'm a legacy of what Margo was talking about, of wealth being stolen from us. I mean, our family was given days to get out of town, and we are literally scattered all along the eastern seaboard, from New York to Chicago, as a result of that one event. So I'd like to hear more about the backlash. I'm sure these wealthy ancestors of yours who were able to have wealth and somehow stay out of trouble, to keep it. How was that possible, that they were able to do that? Because there had to be some kind of backlash from the popular demographic. right, from the white majority. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Shomari, start with you on that because, I found that to be interesting with the characters in your book, how many of them had to navigate, and were, how they had to, when they would enter areas and all eyes would be on them. I don't know. I think that's a really good question. How did they manage?
I think they managed the best that they could. I don't know that they were successful in avoiding that. So Robert Reed Church from Memphis, the black millionaire from Memphis, someone mentioned the race riots of 1866 in Memphis, which were basically just horrific. There was a fight that broke out between white police officers, Irish white police officers, many of whom were Confederate veterans, and black Union officers who were staying in Memphis to keep the peace after the Civil War. Fight broke out, and basically this group of white police officers just went through Memphis, just killing dozens and dozens of black men and violating black women. They even, unfortunately killed a pregnant woman. And so, like you mentioned, Robert Reed Church was the most prominent businessman in Memphis at the time. He had a pool hall. It was also a ballroom and a nightclub, that sort of thing. So the mob marched on his establishment. They robbed him, they looted him, they took his liquor, they took his money, and then they shot him in the head and left him for dead and set the establishment on fire. So somehow he was able to survive that somehow, and went on to continue to build this great empire. But he always kept a gun on himself at all sides, and he was a really, really, he armed himself at all times, and he actually was part of anti-lynching groups, armed groups of black men to push back against lynching. But they all faced it. Mary Ellen Pleasant in California, she was slandered in the papers, had multiple attempts to steal her wealth. People said that she was able to become rich because she was a voodoo queen or because she was extracting investment secrets from white men by having sex with them. One particular character, Jeremiah Hamilton, in New York, the richest black man in New York during the antebellum period and also during the 1860s. During the New York draft riots, another mob, surprise, marched on his house to lynch him by his lamppost. He was able to escape with his life, but they still looted his house and kept his wife hostage for a little while. So for the very, very first generation of black, the black wealth class, I don't know that there was a way around that. James McCune during the draft riots had his pharmacy. He owned a pharmacy in New York. That was destroyed. So for the very, very first generation of African Americans that had wealth, it seemed like it was almost unavoidable. As time went on, I think maybe people learned, different strategies, or you started to see the Great Migration, folks starting to move out of areas where there was so much racial violence and tension. That would be my theory. My great uncle John Drew, who was one of the first black millionaires in the Philadelphia area, he fortunately never encountered any of that, but he was also in, Philadelphia. So I think these millionaires and these, these great titans, they saw what other African Americans were seeing that, forced them to get out of some of these more dangerous areas in the Deep South.
I mean, when you tell that story, I had kind of a flashback because one of my great-grandfathers who actually worked with Robert Church in Memphis moved to Arkansas during Reconstruction. He had been a free person of color in Ohio and was elected to the state legislature and was superintendent of prisons and owned property, owned many acres along the Mississippi River, and owned the biggest house in town, which now is the Allen House, but he's never mentioned in the National Register of Historic Places as having been an owner. But he ultimately left and moved his children to Oberlin because he was pushed out. Madam Walker's older brothers were living in Louisiana. They weren't wealthy, but they and her family minister, who was a state senator, were chased out of Louisiana by the Klan. So people have written books about this, but there probably are so many families with stories like yours. It's like, what is that first generation doing? People who are in Shomari's book, but people who may not be in those books, who may not have become millionaires, but who would be very successful, how that wealth was destroyed, what a difference would have been made had it not been destroyed.
The only reason I know about my ancestor is because I was reading James Weldon Johnson's book of autobiography Along This Way, and it mentioned my ancestor's name, and I knew from family obituaries. I did not know that the NAACP, that he was so significant in that area, that Roy Nash, field secretary for the NAACP, actually went to Abbeville County to investigate the lynching. And that's why I even know who lynched him. You know, their names, their time, I know the time that he was lynched, 3:30, Saturday, the day. So that's because of the significance of his wealth that obviously we do not have, right? Yeah.
You have a book.
Yeah, that's a really good book.
You have a book.
Yeah.
Write it.
I think that a lot of the first generation millionaires or even middle class people of color lived as long as they did, in part because of luck. My maternal grandparents were in Arkansas, and they had over 400 acres of land. And I knew this, but I never asked any questions until my husband said, well, where did they get all this land from? And my mother said that they had a number of relatives who had gotten 40 acres and a mule, and they died, and they just acquired all of this land and pieced it together. So my grandparents had a large farm. They had a general store. They rented out farm equipment even to white residents in the community, and they were very self-sufficient. But my mother told me that a number of times the Klan came looking for her father, and he wasn't there when they came. It was just pure luck that, you know, but he eventually did die because he had to take some medication, and back then everything was compounded, and they gave him the wrong combination, and he died of a massive heart attack. And so as a child, I said, well, why didn't you guys sue? And my mother was like, are you kidding? This is the 40s in the South.
I mean, just to add another story, my great-grandfather was in the Alabama legislature. Before emancipation, because he was the son of the slave owner, he made pots, and he was allowed to go into town. He got a little free time to go into town and sell his pots, and he could keep half the money and give the other half to the owner, who happened to be his father. Okay, after emancipation, and he bought his freedom and his wife's freedom, and after the Civil War, he was in the Alabama legislature, and his name, he was one of the co-signers of the bill that established free public education for the state of Alabama. And one day, his horse and buggy came back without him. And the relative, you ask a relative back then, what happened to him? We don't know. But his horse and buggy came back without him. So that's just another story.
Where did his family, did they move? Did they stay there? What did
No, they stayed. It was Marion, Alabama, which happened to be a town. I mean, it's got a story. But for some reason, they weren't run out of town. That was where some of the New England teachers came down and established a school. And then after that, some of my relatives established what is now Alabama State University. You know, so I mean, there was an education thread there. But he was the one who didn't make it.
Yeah, he
This question is for Shomari because your book actually looked at, I guess, 6 families?
Yeah, I mean, there's 6 main characters, but it's a lot of, basically, yeah, 6.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
So I'm intrigued by one of the threads that this conversation touched on, which was, did black families who had significant wealth early on, and I guess even today, were they heavily invested or not in the quest for racial equity, not just for themselves, but for others? And so the short question is, so what was your learning regarding that question for the 6 families that you researched?
Well, they didn't all start out invested in, the quest for liberation. One of the characters in the book, Hannah Elias, she lived here in New York, right off of Central Park. She was the mistress of a white millionaire. And she lived in this, great mansion with over a dozen servants, had, furs and jewelry and all this great stuff. But she didn't want anything to do with the black community. She tried to change her appearance to make herself look white, at least. And, she just didn't associate with African Americans at all. She would proclaim that I have nothing to do with my race. So her affair and her wealth was revealed during this murder scandal. It's a long story, but, it was revealed in the newspapers. And basically, there were throngs of people that came to her house, threw rocks at her windows, and she was actually hauled off to jail for extortion, right? Because this white guy couldn't have given her all this money because he loved her, and she had to have extorted it from him, right? So she was hauled off to jail. She was put on trial. She was acquitted. But after that event, she slowly became more invested. She started giving money to black churches. She got involved with black real estate developers that help turn over Harlem. So, I think they all ended up there, because I don't think there's any, I don't know if denial is that strong that you could be a black person living in the Reconstruction or Jim Crow era and think that you could be post-racial. But, some of them...
you could be extremely selfish.
Yeah, I don't think that they had the ability to insulate themselves from racism in the way someone maybe could today, where you can move to a nice neighborhood and have nothing to do with your people and just kind of, pretend. Back then, eventually, at least for the folks that I studied, it always made its way to their doorstep. And when they were presented with the realities of racism, with the realities of terror, they changed, and they kind of, it flipped the switch, and, they got more involved in trying to help African Americans, even if it was just selfishly to help their own lives.
I think racism prevents selfishness on some level. As you say, there's a wake-up call, perhaps, and I think that's something that there are many cases, and I think that we see a lot of that today. I'm interested in looking at what are some of the stories of the people who've fallen out of the black men who've fallen out of the 1%. Are there wake-up calls there? And how much of their, I guess you could say, downward mobility could be tied to kind of an ignorance or a protectiveness that they thought was there that prevented them from really negotiating the racism in the society and the way to get ahead in the society around it, possibly. Other questions?
I think this is wonderful, so thank you all. I've been thinking a lot about wealth and how we define wealth, and as we talk about racism and activism, I'm a proud graduate of an HBCU, Howard Law School, and as I have become more successful, and even when I wasn't, I was committed to that institution. And as I found out from others in the endowment area, that many African Americans do not contribute. They do not donate to their institutions. And I think about that, and I think about actually in terms of how we view wealth versus just income. And as we talk about dynasties and intergenerational wealth, I think that there is, number one, a sense of fragility, or a scarcity. Maybe we won't have it for long, or maybe because of the experiences of our families, if we got too successful, it can be gone in a flash. There may be that. Or there may be just a sense of it's not selfishness, but maybe not understanding how we can grow our institutions and a maturity about what that means for us collectively. Because I was very disheartened to find out that the percentage of HBCU graduates that actually give back to their universities on a regular basis or on an annual basis, and it's very slim. And I don't think that that's because of, I think it's because we're not necessarily looking at these institutions as things that we, again, have to nurture and support. And I think that that has to do with wealth and continuation of institutions and how that affects our community and our future.
And some of it's acculturation too, not being acculturated to actually. I think that's another factor.
Yes.
Thoughts about that? One?
Oh, I was just thinking that there's no, blacks don't have cushions. I mean, because there's no acculturation or ability to save or to plan ahead. When the last financial crisis happened, blacks had no cushion, so they suffered and still have not caught up.
Yeah,
How do we get cushion?
So, so much of the philanthropy in the black community is people give to churches. I think many people give right, the long tradition, and people tithe, right. So it's not that there's not philanthropy. It's that the philanthropy is sometimes to families who are in need. But I agree with you that there is a real need to acculturate, to re-educate, to have people support their institutions, especially historically black institutions. I went to 2 historically white institutions, but I've always given. And that giving led to leadership roles in all of those places. And I'm not really wealthy, but I give something. And I think that we need to, I'm always surprised at my friends who went to HBCUs who don't give. Many do, but who will say, well, the bursar's office was mean to me, so I'm never giving them a dime. And that's just like, well, if you want the bursar's office to get better, then you give money and you get involved and you pay attention. So I don't want to put shade on anybody, but I think there is a way, there's a sort of an education about how we need to support our institutions. I know that this is the case with other, black cultural institutions that we don't support enough. I always try to write a little bitty check, so.
I'd like to attest to the fact that Alelia is one of the major supporters of our alma mater, Radcliffe College.
That's true. We went to Radcliffe. She was a role model for us.
So you're a role model for us.
Right here, then Valerie, and then someone else. I thought I saw another hand right here. All right. Right, yeah.
Hi, my name is Tracy, and I'm actually in the middle of producing a documentary film about the history of black wealth and business with Stanley Nelson, who I know you know very well, and Firelight Media. So I'm super excited to be here to hear all of you guys saying in real life the things that have been kind of twirling around my head for the last few weeks, and because I'm in the process of collecting voices to help tell the story, so I wanted to collect all of you.
There you are.
Actually, before I leave. But my question is, having been so kind of deeply enmeshed in this stuff for a while, it's become clear to me that at various points along the history, the federal government intervenes to act as either a bridge or a barrier to black survival, and by extension, the ability of black people to accumulate wealth. A barrier in the case of withdrawing troops from the South after Reconstruction, or the racism of the New Deal excluding domestic workers and farmers, a bridge in Brown v. Board, or in the civil rights laws, or in affirmative action, or even the little crumbs that Richard Nixon dropped, negligible crumbs that he dropped in his minority business association, but we see what a meaningful difference it makes when the federal government intervenes every time in that positive way for Black folks. Yet here we are today with the wealth gap as wide as ever. And so I'm wondering what you think today the role is for the federal government to intervene in a meaningful way when we have a president who's not a maniac, to close the wealth gap, and what needs to be the extent of that intervention in order for Black folks to achieve anything even looking like economic parity today.
Don't keep fighting affirmative action, make the banking bills better. Those are two things.
The banking bill, definitely. That's, yeah.
Banking, housing.
Yes.
There's a new book out about all of the housing, you know, of always aided by local and federal governments, all the housing discriminations.
Is that the Color of Law? Is that the Rothstein book?
Yes, that's right, that's right. So, yeah, banking.
The elephant, though, here, I think, is something that is reparations, I guess, is kind of what, and I mean, that is something that is controversial, as we know in some circles, and others would see it as perhaps one of the only ways to really lead to the kind of, bridging the gap in a meaningful way. I mean, you know, and there are different ways of looking at reparations too. I mean, it's through certain programs. It's not necessarily saying, okay, give money to somebody and to an individual, but that, I mean, there would be some who would argue that that's the only way.
It would have to be strategized so brilliantly. I mean, you know, Gail, you talked about your ancestors and the ways in which they strategized and navigated. You know, who you stayed on the good side of, which party you joined at a certain point. I mean, this would, propaganda-wise, this would have to be, you know, identified as anything but reparations.
Right, exactly. Wipe the word away and do it, yeah.
And, yeah.
So there is a
That
template for it.
Is that via Israel, or is that in America?
Well, I know that there are people in the United States that are receiving reparations, and I know in my office there is a department that tracks down people who had artwork during the Holocaust, and they're helping them track down, for the Jewish community, helping them track down the owners, the original owners of all of the artwork that was taken by the Nazis. And that is all wealth.
Rich people.
But it can be done, you know.
Yeah. I'm not saying it couldn't be done.
But no, it takes some thought, but at least there's an existing template for that.
It's
Well,
very small.
I mean, the Georgetown case is something that is very specific. You can't, I mean, just sort of the blanket reparations, I think you're right. But that, it's sort of like you can't deny that there's proof, there's documentation. So.
And we know that there are slaves who built a lot of these universities. So, I mean, and that's been tracked already. I mean, people are identifying who these slaves are and whose family actually built a lot of these universities, certainly in the North Mix.
Valerie?
Thank you all. This is such a great conversation. I think you all have already touched on the impact of real estate. And Olivia mentioned the Richard Rothstein book, Color of Law. I saw him speak last week, and it's amazing. You know, what he talks about, documenting the role of the federal government, and in many cases, state governments, in enforcing housing discrimination and essentially removing elements of wealth from Black communities, you know, going back, you know, very, very far. So each of you have talked about and maybe, you know, written about in each of your books, you know, some element of that in how that has helped each of the people in your books, you know, rise to wealth. Would you say that without that real estate component, would that be a serious impact to the wealth generation of each of the people you've written about? Or is that, because you're talking about businesses versus just the accumulation of wealth, and I just wanted to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that sort of comes to mind for me, since I don't own any of the houses now, though there are two buildings associated with the Walker legacy that are National Historic Landmarks, the house that she built in Irvington, New York, and the Madam Walker Legacy Center in Indianapolis that was actually built after her death, but was the longtime headquarters. And those are two beautiful buildings. And so in some ways they represent the aspirations that other people can still be inspired by. So while it is not tangible and I can't take it to the bank, I'm really glad those things are there. But the other thing that came to mind is that Madam Walker actually had really begun to invest in real estate. John Nail, who was another very wealthy New Yorker, was her real estate agent, had brokered the building that her daughter bought on 136th Street in 1913. So they were one of the first black people to actually own a building in Harlem during that sort of first wave. But she also owned property where Park West Village is now, and I just think, oh, if only I owned that, then I would have had a trust fund.
I'm just thinking in Chicago. I mean, my book is not formal sociology or politics. It's memoir with history, but. I'm thinking who, for example, in Chicago, the people one thought of as having money were still, because this goes back so long, they owned funeral homes and insurance companies. There was Johnny Johnson, the Ebony Jet Empire, as it was called. And that was impressive, but it still exists. But, a generation later, it's struggling to have its identity. Real estate, Chicago was the most cannily and viciously segregated city in terms of real estate going.
Can I say something about reparations?
Sure.
To circle back. So I don't know if reparations would alleviate the disparities or how much they would, help. But I just think morally, there's no question that we should have reparations. If you look at cotton, what cotton was from the invention of the cotton gin until the eradication of slavery, this was the largest industry in the United States. It's more than half of GDP, So it was one of the largest industries in the world. Natchez, Mississippi, which was the cotton growing capital of the United States and the world, had more millionaires per capita than any other place on earth. Venice, Rome, Paris, and this was all cotton. So this was a huge, huge industry that black people powered. And you got nothing more than maybe a place to lay your head, and whatever food they put in front of you, sometimes in, very degrading ways. So the amount of wealth that's been plundered from African Americans is massive. It's just massive, and so I don't know if it would help, I mean, there's a lot of speculation on if you give people that money, well, how many generations will it last? What do they do with it? But it's their decision to make. Exactly. So I think it's reparations. It's not even an economic question. I think it's a moral question for me.
But then it is a moral question, but then how do we, if it's going to happen, how do we strategically, politically, economically do it? It is a moral question.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, it is. I know in a perfect world, it's something we could just do because it's the right thing to do. But I think you're totally right. Especially in this climate.
Yes, in a world where ACA is, considered a giveaway, where health care is not something that, it's.
Who has a right
that's
to healthcare?
right.
I wanted to circle back to black colleges and African Americans giving back to colleges. I went to Howard undergrad, and I went to American University, also in DC, undergrad. I think, and I also worked at Howard, I think that part of the problem is a lot of HBCUs started out relying on the government for grants to keep themselves alive. And a lot of other institutions always, you know, fundraised. I know that American University, someone calls me every 3 to 6 months. I don't get those calls from Howard. And you know, and American does a lot of ingenious things. Like, I got my master's in '96. And so they would call people and say, if you could just give $19.96, that would be helpful. And you know, so it's all about just communicating. And they would always, I graduated in the School of Communications, so they would always have someone from the School of Communications to call me, ask me about the work that I'd done and being a reporter and so forth. And so there was this effort to join you with a younger generation.
Okay, we have time for about 2 more questions. This has been a great, right here. Okay.
So much to comment on, but it's been excellent. I just did want to get back to where in the South I happen to know my parents got money because their parents were sharecroppers in the South. So there was a ton of paperwork they had to complete, and the little bit of dollars they got back, I'm sure had no value whatsoever to what was taken from them at the time. But they actually got money back for that. So the government did have that out there, and not only my father, his sister, his brother, because they would during certain times of the year have to go and pick cotton. So they were able to prove it and that kind of thing. But I mean, that was just a story just to say that the government has tried to do something, but it's never the fair or right amount, no matter how you try to cut it. But the other thing in property, I think that's extremely important. Even when you're in certain communities, how the government, again, will tax certain communities, higher taxes on certain communities, the lower value of the home. So it's just so many governmental things that are happening out there that I think we're not as educated as we should be to understand, to advocate. So I'm just wondering what the thought is on the panel, from the panel, really giving back to the government, because I do think it does do things, and we're just not even quite aware or educated enough to speak to that, to bring something up to take action on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There definitely are programs out there and initiatives that, you know, people, you know, aren't aware of. But I mean, I don't think there's anything on the scale, you know, that you alluded to that actually, you know, gives people back, you know, what they put in, you know, adjusted for inflation. You know, so it's a tough thing.
Other questions right here?
So unless I'm listening, and thank you all so very much. Hi, Mom. In talking about scale, which I think is hugely important, because even the word dynasty somehow implies time. It implies we're going back into the past, and it implies that there's a future. And in the past, for white America, there's guilt, and in the future, it's fear. So I don't think they're going to make that particular journey. And I don't think they want particularly to entertain even the word. I think it's pretty terrifying. And you think of what makes a dynasty, indeed houses, indeed institutions. Bring it. That's children. And thinking about, and all distracted babies are delicious, thinking about what these ladies were saying about how there are programs, but there's you have to be an investigator to discern and find the one that applies to you. And I agree with you completely, but we would have to ask the United States of America to plead guilty. And I don't see that. I mean, I would love to ask this panel, do you think that's going to happen?
You know, look at what the United States does whenever it's asked to do something like an apology to the Japanese,
Yeah.
or to Native Americans. You know, this hollow, empty, rhetorically predictable and drab document is read into the record, and then nothing concrete happens. Probably even easier to track with Native Americans because it's ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. You know, I think there were there reparations to the Japanese?
Yes, they got a little bit of money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Not enough, I'm
No.
sure, but, yeah, but so
It was
no.
I mean, comparative to the Native Americans and to the African Americans, it was a short, intense. I went to school with a girl who had been in a detention camp, who was a Japanese American, and she was one of my best friends. And she talked about what was life. I mean, it wasn't a concentration camp. It was a concentration camp, but it wasn't a German-style concentration camp. It was an American-style,
Murder.
wholesome
Yes.
movies, baseball games, that kind of thing. But it was definitely a concentration camp.
Yeah.
And it was actually instigated by rich white farmers who were jealous of the Japanese success.
Who took over their houses.
Who took over their houses and their
too. They
jobs
had nothing
and their
to come
land.
back to. So
Yes.
certain
Yes.
patterns are,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the othering of people, and it's the way history is taught. History is still how history is taught about slavery, about Reconstruction, about the 19th century, about the early 20th century, the lies that are perpetuated, and we see it in the debates about the Confederate statues.
So maybe we could say that, oh, I'm so sorry. That maybe there's an analogy to the governmental climate now and what was the annihilation of the successful black man. Maybe this is just the macro of that. I mean, we just had a black president, so the only thing to do then would be to destroy him completely. Yeah, yeah.
You know, one of the interesting things, of course, we remember too would be Bill Clinton's apology for slavery, if we remember, and that just how that was received, and how even controversial it was from some people that he apologized, and that there were some people who also thought such an apology was in fact necessary and was a step in the right direction. So, I mean, I think that, when you're growing from an apology to actual reparations, I think you've raised a very interesting question. Is the United States of America going to accept guilt? And I think that's also a question that I think is very political. It depends on what district you're in and what kinds of voters you serve, to whether or not you would advocate for something like that to begin with.
I think it was Churchill who said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options.
No, it's very
true.
Very true. Any other questions? We were going to leave some time for a more book signing, but do we have any more questions or comments? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Great questions and comments.